And this is one of those days, I know. So, they are covered by a membrane. We call these membranes the meninges. The meninges. This membrane is continuous, covering the entire brain and the entire spinal cord. It is composed of 3 separate layers. The outermost layer is called the dura mater, or dura mater, the dura mater, which literally means tough mother. And as you might imagine, it's the thickest, dense white fibrous connective tissue. The next one in is called the arachnoid mater, the arachnoid mater. It is thin, does not have blood vessels, and it looks almost like a spider's web, a spider's web. Below this, you have a thin layer called the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space. This is on page 399, David. That space is filled with a thin, watery fluid called the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. Essentially, this acts as a water-filled cushion for the brain and the spinal cord. They essentially float in this fluid. That's a bit of an exaggeration and an overstatement, but I think it helps you visualize it and understand it a little better. Am I right? And then below that, you've got something called the pia mater, the pia mater. Or delicate mother, gentle mother. This contains a lot of nerves. It's very thin, contains a lot of blood vessels, and it follows both the gyri and the sulci of the brain. It follows both the gyri and the sulci of the brain. Do you all need a reminder what gyri and sulci are? Ridges and valleys, remember that? The meninges act to protect the brain. They are also attached to the inside of the skull. They are essentially contiguous with the periosteum of the bones of the skull. If the meninges get inflamed, it is called meningitis. Meningitis. There's a lot of things that can cause this. The most common two are viral meningitis and bacterial meningitis. Interestingly enough, of the two, viral meningitis is less of a threat than bacterial. It's one of the rare cases where you have both forms, and the viral form is actually the less deadly of the two. Bacterial meningitis is generally not common except among one group, college-age students who live together in close quarters. Dorms are notorious for the spread of this. What makes it so deadly or so bad isn't the fact that it necessarily could kill people, although it can, but in an effort to fight the disease, the body essentially constricts the peripheral blood vessels to the point where there is insufficient blood flow to your extremities for them to survive. In other words, fingers, toes, hands, feet die. And to avoid gangrene, which is essentially rotting of the dead tissue, they actually have to amputate. There have been cases where people have lost all 4 limbs to this. It's yet another one of those that can be prevented with a simple vaccine, but because of the anti-vax movement, it's not as popular as it should be. So any questions about the meninges? Okay, below that you have the brain itself. The brain is basically made up of 2 divisions. There is the large chunk of the brain which sits on top called the cerebrum. That's probably about 85% of the brain, give or take. Below that, and at the very back, you have this separate structure that's about the size of a baseball or a softball, and it's called the cerebellum. The cerebellum. Don't worry, we'll be getting into the functions of these more than you ever wanted to know. Is everybody with me? Need me to slow down, speed up, keep going? I'm not really following along with the textbook because while I think the textbook is generally excellent in most cases, as I think I've mentioned before, when it comes to the nervous system, he does a really deep dive, and I don't think most of us plan on careers as neurosurgeons, am I correct? So I'm trying to give you more of an overview. So the outermost layer of the cerebrum is called out of the brain, the outermost layer is called the cortex. The outermost layer of the cerebrum is the cerebellar cortex. The outermost region of the cerebellum is the cerebellar cortex. These regions are mostly made up of gray matter. And if you remember, those are the ones that have unmyelinated axons. Below that, you have primarily white matter. And that makes up the majority of the brain. Now that said, you do have concentrations of gray matter deep in both the cerebrum and the cerebellum. And these are known as nuclei. And typically these are neurons that share a common function. In the deepest part of the brain, you have hollow spaces that are called ventricles. These are 4 cavities that are filled with CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. You have 2 lateral ventricles. Below that in the center, you have the 3rd ventricle. Then you've got a short tube extending down through the brain stem where you will find the 4th ventricle, The lateral ventricles are connected through what we call the cerebral aqueduct, And that's just a channel that goes through the midbrain. Inside these ventricles, as I said, you find the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid. The CSF flows from the lateral ventricles to the 3rd, to the 4th, and then through the subarachnoid space or the spinal cord. You actually have what we call the central canal of the spinal cord that extends pretty much the length of it. It's located in the very, very center, and it's a narrow channel that is filled with CSF. The CSF plays a variety of functions. Number 1, it acts as a cushion. It provides buoyancy. It cushions. It helps deliver nutrients to the brain. It removes waste. It has an immune function as well. You'll find white blood cells in there. You'll find immunoglobulins or antibodies. And finally, it provides a stable chemical environment for the brain. The body produces about 500 milliliters of it per day. but at any given time, you've only got about 150 milliliters total inside the ventricles and central canal of the CNS. It's constantly circulating and being replaced. Now, it's important to understand this is not blood. It does not have red blood cells. It's essentially just a fluid with a few things in it. It's produced by a structure called the choroid complex. The choroid complex. Whenever they suspect a neurological issue, they will often take a sample of the CSF. Y'all ever heard of a procedure called a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap? This is spinal tap. They just literally take a needle and go through the spinal cord and sample it.
I heard
Yes,
it's
sir.
painful as well. I said I heard it's painful as well.
I assure you, it is not something you want to have done unless you have to have it. Painful is a good term to begin to describe it. Excruciating, torturous might be more accurate.
Yeah.
Because don't you have to be awake for it? They can't put you to sleep. Why is it that they can't put you to sleep for it?
So they can make sure that they drive the big honking needle into the central canal and not into some important part of your spinal cord that you might need later. Same reason why they have you conscious for a lot of brain surgery. When they start cutting away at your brain and you suddenly stop speaking, they realize they've cut too far. Don't look at me, I'm not the one doing this. There's a reason I'm not a neurosurgeon. I can assure you from personal experience, however, a lumbar puncture is not something to be done lightly. 0 of 5 stars, do not recommend. That would be my Yelp review. Do y'all still do Yelp? I don't even know what y'all use anymore. He's laughing at me because he's never even heard of Yelp. Anyway, are there any questions about the CSF? A lumbar puncture allows determination typically of what a causative agent is for meningitis. It allows you to see how well the immune response is going, and also it gauge the general health of the CNS without a more invasive procedure. So everybody got that? And let me see. So we've talked about, oh yes, the spinal cord. If you take a cross section of it, cut it like this, you're going to see that it is primarily made up of white matter. Inside it, you've got a little butterfly-shaped structure made up of gray matter. Does everybody see this? There's a diagram in your book, but I like this one because it actually is in white and gray. Does everybody see that tiny, tiny little hole right there in the center? That is the central canal, which contains the cerebrospinal fluid. So it's not a lot, but it is there. So are there any questions about the overall structure of the CNS? So let's talk about regions and functions. Does anybody know what the primary function of the spinal cord is?
Movement, like enabling movement and getting nerves to.
Well, it's basically a switchboard or a relay station. The movement signals come from the brain, they go out from the spinal cord. The senses come in from the peripheral nervous system and they go into the spinal cord. And that is by far the most common function of the spinal cord. Transmitting impulses up and down from the brain, to and from. However, you may not be aware of the fact that the spinal cord actually does do some integration and processing as well. If you remember when we first talked about the CNS, we said that was the primary function of the CNS, right? The spinal cord plays a role in that. These responses completely bypass the brain. Make sure you get that down in black and white in your notes. Or red and white or blue and white, whatever you're using. Does anybody know what these types of responses are called? Reflexes. Reflexes. We call the entire pathway a reflex arc. A reflex arc. The reflex arc consists of 5 components. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 1 are the receptors. These are what detect the stimulus. These actually detect the stimulus. Whether it's pressure, heat, pain, sound, whatever. This stimulates a sensory neuron, which is component number 2. It stimulates a sensory neuron. The sensory neurons carry the signal to the spinal cord, not the brain. The spinal cord itself acts to integrate and process the information. That's number 3. The integration and processing center, which is the spinal cord itself. Once that has occurred, it stimulates a motor neuron, a motor neuron. This carries the nerve impulse out. And then finally, component 5 are the effectors, Most of the time when we think about reflexes, we think of the effectors as being muscles, and they are. But I want to also let you know that they can be glands as well. Anybody in here like roller coasters? A few of you raising your hands. You get on that and it goes clank, 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 and then you go up and you realize you're getting higher and higher, and you see birds flying beneath you. Then you see planes flying beneath you, and then the space shuttle, and you get up there to the top, and right before you go over, you go, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. And then the bottom falls out, right? That feeling you get is a reflex due to your adrenal glands. You have no control over it. And that is the advantage of reflexes. They are fast. You respond faster than you can think about it. Make sure you get that down. They are completely and totally involuntary because they do not involve the brain in any way, shape, form, or fashion. Jump scares, people almost always flinch. That's because it's a reflex. If you have a bright light go off, you are automatically going to blink. You ever notice that once it starts, it's impossible to stifle a sneeze? You see where I'm going with this? It's not just a reflexive muscle jerk. All kinds of responses can be due to reflexes. The advantages are speed, 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 speed. Generally, it's to protect the body. You see something coming at you, you duck. Close your eyes. You sneeze. It can also mean that you are maintaining homeostasis. In other words, things like your blood pressure, digestion. Very often, the controls for those are reflexive. You don't think about digesting and moving the food through your digestive system. That's because your reflexes move it for you. You tend to have three types of reflexes. The first are what we call inborn or primitive. Inborn or primitive. If you stick a finger near a baby's mouth, does it automatically do? Puts it in and begins to try to suckle on it, doesn't it? Suckling is a inborn reflex. Second are what we call deep tendon reflexes. Deep tendon. These are the knee-jerk response. You've heard that term. It's where the doctor hits you with the little hammer and your leg flies up. It's just reflexive due to stimulation of that deep tendon. Basically a response to stretching. And finally, we have what we call superficial reflexes. Superficial reflexes. And these are the various ones triggered by stimulation of the skin. You ever get goosebumps? Cold? An itch that you absolutely can't ignore and have to scratch? A tickle? You get the idea. If you're ticklish, you literally can't stop from being tickled, can you? You automatically respond. It's because it's a reflex. And all of those involve both the PNS and the spinal cord, but not the brain. The PNS, the spinal cord, but not the brain. Questions about that? So the regions of the brain itself. Over the course of a lifetime, say between age 20 and 90, you lose both gray matter and white matter. You can lose up to about 25% of your white matter and about 10 to 15% of your gray matter. It's just normal. Anytime you've got an active system, you've got the laws of thermodynamics apply, eventually entropy will increase, you will get disorder. The brain itself as a whole, we've talked about the two hemispheres, right? But now what we're going to talk about are the 5 lobes. Now keep in mind, all of these lobes or regions can be found on both the right and the left sides. We are not talking about specific regions so much as general regions. Those brains that we had, the models that we've looked at in lab, they're nicely color labeled, aren't they? A real brain does not look like that. There is no line of demarcation that says now we're leaving the frontal lobe and entering the parietal lobe. So make sure you understand these are generalizations. Underline that word. So let's just start with the front. The first one is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe. This is the one that is located right behind the forehead. Haley is up there pointing at her head. Yep, that's it, Haley. And it is the largest of all the parts of the brain. This is also the site of executive functions. Executive functions. That is the first and most important of the functions of the brain, or the frontal lobe. Planning, categorizing, organizing, problem solving, decision making, prioritizing your attention. All of this falls under the category of executive functions found in the frontal lobe. Did anyone need or want me to repeat any of those? Okay, I'll assume you got them all. Voluntary movement. And by this, we mean fine motor control. When I reach out to get my drink can and I close my fingers around it sufficiently to grasp it firmly, but I'm not crushing the can, and I bring it not to my eye, not to my ear, but to my mouth. That is a function of my frontal lobe. Fine motor control. Language production. This portion of the frontal lobe is called Broca's area. B-R-O-C-A''S, capitalized. Broca's area. This is responsible for both speaking and producing language. So not only making the sounds, but making the sounds that you want that others will be able to interpret and understand. Fourth function. Behavior slash personality. Behavior slash personality. What makes you, you? The easiest one to identify here is what we call impulse control. Impulse control. Some people have no impulse control. I think most of you are too young to remember who Bobby Knight was. He was the head basketball coach at Indiana University decades ago, and he had a temper. He would actually throw chairs at players, both his and the other teams, the referees, and he got away with it because he won. That is clearly a man who has poor impulse control. They're stimulated by something, they give into it. Everybody see where I'm going with this? As you might imagine, that plays a huge role in a lot of behaviors that are considered antisocial behaviors, a lot of behaviors that are considered unacceptable in society, a lot of behaviors like addiction. It's all part of your impulse control in your frontal lobe. Social behavior. We know what is socially acceptable and what is not. Now, I'm not saying this is instinctive, it's learned behavior, but this is where you match up with your learned behavior with the behavior of people around you, and you exhibit appropriate behavior. That's why you're sitting back there taking notes while I'm talking rather than talking to your friend. Or texting, as the case may be. Social behavior. Emotional expression. Seat of your emotions. Anger, love, fear. I think you see why we say that this is the largest part, the seat of yourself, essentially. Also, your working memory. Your working memory. Short-term memory might be another term you could use for it. It's when I give you a list of steps and you write down all 3 steps in sequence. As soon as you step out the door, you forget them because you don't have to use them immediately. Everybody see how that goes? Short-term or working memory. Now, it's very important that you differentiate that from long-term. And when we say short-term, we mean literally short-term, immediate. It's in your mind now, but the instant you set your coffee cup down and you walk away and get into something else, you forgot where you put your coffee cup, right? We've all done that. The typical absent-minded professor stuff. I have lived up to that stereotype more times than I wish to relate. Also, motivation slash reward. We've talked about dopamine and how dopamine is the feel-good neurotransmitter, right? You eat sweets, you get your chocolate bar, you get a burst of dopamine. It rewards you. That behavior takes place in the frontal lobe. You snort a gram of cocaine, it rewards you. That behavior also takes place in the frontal lobe. And yeah, I'm being a little sarcastic, but you see where and how it affects. I want you to realize these things do affect your brain. Damage to the frontal lobe can lead to severe personality changes, poor impulse control, difficulty with planning. I think I've shared with you the example of Phineas Gage, didn't I?
Yeah.
And if you have ever heard of a surgery called a frontal lobotomy, this is the area of the brain that was destroyed. The standard way to do it was to stick essentially an ice pick through your eyeball, get it into your brain and twist it around until you turn the frontal lobe to goop. Don't look at me, I didn't do it. I think the most famous example of this was Rose Kennedy, President Kennedy's sister. She was considered a difficult youngster, and I think it was age 18 or 19. Her father made her undergo a lobotomy, and she was never the same after that. So any questions about the frontal lobe, its function? Make sure you take note of Broca's area. Make sure you know the functions. Make sure you know it is the largest. So behind the frontal lobe, on top, notice we said on top, so we're up here. Which one is that?
Parietal.
The parietal lobe, very good. The parietal lobe is responsible for sensory information. Spatial awareness, where objects are located to each other in space. For example, I know that Piper is more distant from me than Jace. That's my parietal lobe that's telling me that. We use this for navigation. Navigation, getting from point A to point B. A structure called the primary cortex. The primary cortex receives sensations that are primarily associated with touch. We call those somatosensory sensations. Somatosensory, the somatic system. Pain. Pressure. Temperature. Proprioception. Does anybody need me to spell that? P-R-O-P-R-I-O-C-E-P-T-I-O-N. Proprioception. And proprioception is a fancy term for body position. Body position. I can tell that my feet are tucked under me and my legs are crossed, and I am not sitting up straight, but I have my back at about a 30-degree angle because I also have pain from my lower back from where I got it damaged all those years ago. All of that is my primary cortex functioning as a single unit. Does everybody see that? So the primary cortex is the main function. Letting you know where you are in space, letting you know what's touching you, what temperature it is, how it's touching you, whether it's too much and damaging you, whether it's too sharp, too cold, too heavy. You get the idea. Spatial awareness, your sense of direction relative to things. Left versus right, up versus down. Front versus rear. Where things are in relation to you in three-dimensional space. Related to this is something called the dorsal stream. The dorsal stream. Another way of stating this would be visuospatial processing. Using your vision to guide actions. When you reach out and grasp something, how far do you have to reach to grasp it? Is it something that is out of your touch and requires you to move your body? That's the dorsal stream telling you the where and the how of getting from here to there to get it. Everybody got that? Language and cognition. Notice I did not say language and speaking. Broca's area is what does that for you. the language and cognition function of the parietal lobe allows you to understand written language, mathematical reasoning. When you see 2 plus 3, you know what the number 2 means, you know what the number 3 means, you know that together they mean 5. That takes place in the parietal lobe. Manipulating objects. Clockwise versus counterclockwise. Right versus left. North versus south. East versus west. Just stand up. Everybody got that? And attention. Attention. Focusing on specific stimuli. When you would rather not listen to my voice and you would rather stretch or yawn or move or text or watch TikTok or whatever else you want to do. One thing I want to point out, as I said, the brain works as a whole. We are identifying where specific locations of the brain have primary functions. But all of the units of the brain are connected, aren't they? Keep that in mind. What's happening in one can and will affect what's happening in another. The point I want to bring up here is a lot, and I do mean a lot, of our behaviors are not instinctive, but rather learned. Learned behaviors. You all think differently than I do. You all think nothing of looking at your phone and texting your buddy while having your tablet up while I'm lecturing. Because that is what you have grown up doing. Am I right? I didn't. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have texting. Doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean it's bad. It just means we have learned different behaviors. Does everybody see that? No need to kick the chair. So what happens when you get damage to the parietal lobe? Ataxia and apraxia. Ataxia and apraxia. Ataxia, you can't really tell where something is. I tell my hand to reach for my can, so instead I grab my tablet. Does everybody see that? That's ataxia. Apraxia is difficulty planning complex movements. Learning to dance. If you have apraxia, you may never learn to dance. Difficulty navigating. Related to this, there's an odd phenomenon called neglect syndrome. Neglect syndrome. Neglect syndrome essentially means you ignore stimuli from one side or the other. So I have students over here raising their hand, and instead I call on you. That's generally a sign of damage to the parietal lobe. Any questions? How many pages y'all got so far?
2.25.
So I'm not going too fast, I'm not beating you down. Good. Below that, right around in here, what's that part of the brain called? The temporal lobe, or the temporal lobe, exactly. These are the ones near the ears. And since they're near the ears, as you might expect, one of their functions is auditory processing. This is where sound gets turned into usable information. Frequency, pitch, and volume. Frequency, pitch, and volume. That's why raising your voice has something different than softening your voice. See where I'm going with this? Obviously, this is critical in interpreting your spoken language. Your spoken language. We call this Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area. This is usually found in the left temporal lobe. The left temporal lobe. This is the primary center of the brain for understanding language. The surrounding areas handle what we call semantic processing, which is picking a specific word, saying devastate versus decimate, for example. Devastate means to destroy handily. Decimate is often used incorrectly because it means you only destroy 1/10 of something. Decimal. But most of you didn't know that, did you? It's a learned behavior. People that have big vocabularies have a big Wernicke's area. Again, though, there's nothing in there saying, this is Wernicke's area, you're now leaving Wernicke's area. You've seen through neuroplasticity that one lobe or one hemisphere can take over for another, right? So everybody got that? Visual perception, and by perception, we mean recognition. I look back and I know that that's Aslan sitting back there, Veronica sitting up here. I recognize Jace's face. You see where I'm going with this? Object recognition. That is a coffee cup. This is a drink can. Questions? Okay, two of the big ones. Well, let's get one more. Sensory input. Sensory input. Primarily olfaction and gustation. Olfaction and gustation. G-U-S-T-A-T-I-O-N. Does anybody know what the gustatory response is?
So it's taste.
Taste. Very good. Somebody's been doing the reading. The rest of y'all are just cruising on autopilot. Olfaction is a sense of smell. Gustation, or the gustatory sense, is taste. It processes and integrates those. This is one of the reasons why you use both senses simultaneously. And now the two biggest ones. Emotional responses. This is the region of the brain that processes emotions. And it connects them to memories. And that is probably the most important function of this, memory formation. There are two specialized regions that are connected with these. The amygdala, A-M-Y-G-D-A-L-A, the amygdala, which is part of the medial temporal lobe, located there in the middle, is responsible for the emotional processing. And the hippocampus, which is also located in the medial temporal lobe, or the middle, is the one responsible for long-term memory formation, the hippocampus. Anybody ever heard of retrograde amnesia? It means you are incapable of forming long-term memories. Basically, your short-term memory is the only working memory you have. Due to the type of damage and where it's located, you may have a longer short-term window than most people. Anybody here ever seen the movie Memento? That is probably the single best made movie I have ever seen, because the main character suffers from this and he is trying to solve his wife's murder, but he can only remember 15 minutes at a time. And the way the movie is structured, you share his experience. It's pretty amazing. If you ever get a chance that you're bored one weekend, you'll probably end up watching it 15 times and still finding things out. Who's that guy that did Batman, all those horrible Batman movies? Christopher Nolan? He's the one that did it. I think it was his first movie, one of his first ones. Anyway, all that is due to the temporal lobe, the temporal lobe. Any questions about it? Differences between the right and the left. The left is primarily language, verbal memory, and speech. The right is your visual memory and music. Been going over an hour and we're still going strong. I love it. Okay, next up, what is the one located at the very back?
Occipital.
The occipital lobe. The occipital. This one primarily plays a key role in visual processing. This is where essentially everything related to your sight occurs. This is what we call the primary visual cortex. The primary visual cortex. It takes the raw input from the retina via the thalamus. It converts the image on your retina into an image in your brain. Surrounding this, we've got what we call the secondary visual cortex, or the extrastriate cortex. It surrounds the primary visual cortex and it converts the signals that you receive from the retina into things like motion, color, recognition of both of those. It transmits this to different lobes for different purposes. We have what we call the ventral stream, And this sends information to the temporal lobe, which allows object and face recognition. So the ventral stream actually gives the temporal lobe the information it needs to allow recognition of those objects. Sometimes called the what pathway, the what visual pathway, because it's telling you what you see. I've already mentioned the dorsal stream, sometimes called the how or where pathway, the how or where pathway. This connects to the parietal lobe and allows for spatial awareness, like we mentioned, and also tracking of moving objects. It allows you to track the motion. Everybody get those? So we also have visual spatial processing, analyzes distance, depth, range, spatial organization, sequences. And the last one would be reading and comprehension. Allows you to interpret letters, words, symbols. What happens if you get damage to the occipital lobe? Well, the most obvious effect would probably be blindness. Could be total, could be partial. Something called agnosia, A-G-N-O-S-I-A, visual agnosia. This means you literally cannot interpret faces or objects. You see a face and you don't know who it is. Hallucinations, any kind of visual hallucination. Now keep in mind, this can also be misidentifying things. The brain does not like gaps and it tries to fill them in. So when you see a bear moving through the woods, your brain interprets it, because you're seeing it through heavy foliage, as Bigfoot. A lot of these supposed ghost videos that you see on YouTube or TikTok, you'll see some flickering shadow in the background and your body or your mind puts an ID on that. Keep in mind, that's not a hallucination, that's an illusion, a visual illusion. So make sure you get that down. Optical illusions, you've heard of those. All of this is going on in your occipital lobe, and damage to it can mean that you have that. Alexia, A-L-E-X-I-A. Bet you didn't know this was a condition, did you? Alexia is when you have difficulty recognizing words or letters. Reading difficulties. Dyslexia is a form of alexia. You see where we're going with this. Doesn't mean you're stupid, it just means that literally your occipital lobe has difficulty interpreting the sensations for whatever reason. And you all look like you're about to go under the table.